Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to February 1898. Well, actually, February, March, April of 1898. And we're going to look at the events leading up to the Spanish American War. And specifically, we're going to be looking a little bit at the explosion of the U.S.S. Maine. And Chris, this, nowadays, this is one of those events that I think for the average person on the street has sort of got buried. But at the time in 1898, when the U.S.S. Maine exploded, this was headline news. It certainly wasn't as big as 9/11, but it was something that was, for a lot of people in America, this was a clarion call to war.
And I think one of the things that happens is when people who are interested in American history and they think about wars, it's easy to go from the American Revolution to the Civil War. And then we jump right into World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and then, of course, the Gulf Wars, and then, even recently. And, right there in the middle, there is this very crucial period in not just American history, but also in world history, where you start to see in this state of imperialism where the United States kind of gets itself involved in some things that creates some serious disagreement, not just, in Spain or what will really be Cuba, but especially in the United States, because so many things come out of this. You mentioned headline news, and to be honest, it is the U.S.S. Maine that really drives this differentiation between what is fake news and what is real news through something that's known as yellow journalism. And so people start getting misinformation, disinformation, and the next thing you know is you have an all-out war that basically can be started because of the events of the U.S.S. Maine, but how it was characterized in the newspaper in America.
Chris, you mentioned a thing called yellow journalism. Do you care to explain what that was?
So basically what you would see is during this time, there's a couple of, you think about entertainment and you think about media. We do not have televisions and the radio and all of that. We have newspapers. That's how we get the information. And during this time, there's William Randolph Hearst and there's Joseph Pulitzer, who are two individuals that are vying for not just the attention of the average American, but also in money. And, Ray, we see this today in society as people will use gotcha news, or they use headlines that will draw your attention. All somebody has to do to really understand yellow journalism is you look at social media. You look at a Twitter feed or a Facebook post or a social media aspect, and somebody's like, what? Did I just read that right? And it draws people to the page. And in today's society, those pages generate revenue. It generates attention. Well, back then, if Pulitzer or Hearst could, get somebody to read their newspaper, then that penny press, they were going to get that money. And so they would create these unsubstantiated stories from this sensationalist yellow press. And that would lead to outrage among people. How dare this is going on? There needs to be something done. And so in this situation, you have these events going on in Cuba, and the newspapers get involved, which basically pushes America to war, where you have the individuals say, stop the violence, stop the violence. And it really comes back to a thing that's going on in the Spanish government in Cuba, to where you have this individual who's, I'm not going to try to pronounce, well, I am going to try to pronounce it. I'm sure I'll mess it up. But, his name was General Valeriano Weyler, but he was really known as the Butcher. And he was doing these things which were known as reconcentration camps, in which he's trying to get people to be reprogrammed. And it is basically affects, I think, over 100,000 Cubans who lose their lives through starvation and a variety of other things. And so America reads this in an American newspaper, and Ray, all they have is what the news is reporting. And they say, we as Americans have got to stop this. And so that sends the Americans down to Cuba to try to stop it.
Yeah, I mean, the Americans are very sympathetic with the Cuban cause, and it's certainly understandable. Here you have the Cuban people, to some degree, trying to rise up against the Spanish, I guess we could put it in modern terms, the Spanish occupiers, and trying to overthrow that control that they have on them. So the American, you can certainly see why the American people at the time would already have a sensitive ear, to the situation down there in Cuba. So it's in that context that you mentioned, and you were talking about, answering the question about yellow journalism. I wrote down in my notes here, two words: clickbait.
Mm.
They didn't have the internet to click on stuff back then, but clickbait, and basically what it was clickbait on the front page of a newspaper. You had ads like Spanish treachery, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. And you mentioned Hearst, and he offered $50,000 for anyone who would come up with evidence that Spain had something to do with the destruction of the Maine. So these weren't, I guess we could say, Chris, these weren't responsible journalists. These yellow journalists.
Yeah, and this is kind of off the point, but to the point. For our listeners, they really want a good understanding of how the newspaper industry worked during this time. There's a good Broadway show, but it also turned into a movie that people could find probably on Disney Plus or whatever. It was called Newsies.
Mhm.
And you really start to see this battle between Pulitzer and Hearst in the selling of newspapers to make a profit, and how they basically made up stories just so they could sell the newspaper, because people were sensationalists. They liked murder. They liked, the idea that Jack the Ripper was on the streets. They like those things. And it's the same thing today, right? Turn on the 11 o'clock news, and what's the first thing that we're hit with? We're not hit with a wonderful puppy. We're not hit with a really nice feel-good story. That's always at the end of the news when people have turned it off after the weather. No, what people want is they want to know about, the violence. They want to know about all of the other things going on. Times haven't changed. That's how it was back in the day. And in this situation, the American people are saying, why are we sitting here doing nothing about it? To the point where the president of the United States, because of this yellow journalism, because of Pulitzer and Hearst, he has to send a battleship known as the U.S.S. Maine to Cuba to basically offer some level of protection or assurance that, hey, if anything bad happens to you guys down here in Cuba, we're going to take care of you. However, it also must be stated that just because the ship goes down there does not mean that they need to take sides. They're down there to offer a sense of protection, but they're not taking sides. And so when the ship gets down there, the commander of the ship tells everybody, says, listen, we're staying on this ship. Don't think about going into the port of Havana. Don't think about making yourself seen, because if they see an American soldier in Cuba, then the Spaniards are going to think that we're siding with Cuba, and that's going to cause an all-out war. And so the ship is there, the people are there, but they're designed to just be seen and not heard.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about, you talk about the ship that is sent down there, the USS Maine. The USS Maine is a very fascinating ship because it is sent down to Cuba, to Havana, in January of 1898. And at that point, it's only about 3 years old at this particular point. It had come off the line in 1895. It had taken several years to build, and it was a second class battleship. So this was a serious battleship that was sent down there. It was a relatively new battleship at the time. It is sent down there. It's got almost 300, I believe it was almost 300 crew aboard this ship, and it's down there, and it's not there long before February 15 of 1898 comes. And when that happens, around 10 o'clock on the evening of February 15, 1898, there's an explosion on the front, the forward part of the ship. There's an explosion. A good number of people are killed. I think there's almost 270 people are killed. It's a pretty bad event, and this event is going to put that yellow journalism into high gear, and it's going to be what I guess you could say is the final straw to push President McKinley into war with
Yeah,
Spain.
the explosion, I mean, rocks the harbor, literally. I mean, it is massive. And I remember reading something about the captain of the ship, or the commander of the ship. His name was Sigsbee. And he said, look, it was just a normal night. I'm sitting here writing letters home to loved ones. You've got men on the ship doing their nightly duties. You've got others that are kind of getting ready to go to bed. So all of these things are taking place. It's a normal night, and then there is a huge explosion in which the vessel, the ship, actually lurches, if you will. I mean, almost to the point where it's I mean, it's rocking back and forth, and there's huge smoke, and other ships that were nearby saw what happened, and I mean, you've got man overboard, you've got people that are trapped, you have a huge situation with smaller fires now spreading throughout the ship. And, the commander doesn't know what's going on. Nobody knows what's happening. Everybody is seeing this. And now you have a delicate situation, because you have tensions between Spain and the United States already, because you're kind of in Havana, what's there. And so Sigsbee has to really fine tune his writing about the incident, and kind of what happened, and how does an American ship in the port of Havana just all of a sudden blow up. And the Navy goes down and begins an investigation. The captain records his notes, and Ray, all of a sudden, as you mentioned, all of these rumors, this clickbait, all of these things starts to come up, and the U.S. Navy has to give a response. They have to let the people know, because I mean, Ray, what's the American people, when they hear about it, what do they automatically assume? Somebody blew up the ship.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at the immediate response of the military. Um, President McKinley, he was initially told when he was awakened with the news, was that it was an accident. Other military leaders initially said, yeah, it was an accident. But then, of course, other voices started coming in saying, well, wait a minute, let's think about this. Maybe this was a mine, a Spanish mine, or something like that. One of the people who actually, I don't know that he was the first to bring it up, certainly, but started pushing the idea that maybe this was more than an accident, was at that point Assistant Navy Secretary Theodore Roosevelt, who basically comes in and says, wait, let's stop all this talk of an accident. Maybe there was more to this. Maybe this was Spanish treachery that was involved in this. And so you get this idea that there was a mine that somehow blew up the ship. But of course, at that point, there was just no evidence either way. Was it a mine? Was it somebody planting something? Was it coal room? What was it? At this point, nobody knows. But the yellow journalists really jump on this and start with the cartoons and the headlines. Remember the Maine, and don't forget the starving Cubans, or the more famous remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Now, those type of headlines start running through newspapers in the United States, and of course, it riles people up. How dare the Spanish attack our soldiers and kill 270 some soldiers? How dare they do that? We've got to take action as a result.
But here's the other thing that goes to this, is that people in today's society, it's the same as people back then in 1898. They didn't trust the government. They didn't rely on the government to fully tell them the truth. And the U.S. Navy does create an investigation immediately. They send people down there, and they do their investigation, and they actually say it was a mine. A mine did it. A mine blew up the ship. That's our report. And they take it back, and Hearst, Pulitzer, the press gets it. But there's one thing the government left out, and that, I think, is the key point in this, is that when the United States government said, our report shows that a mine blew up the USS Maine, but they gave no blame as to who did it. They did not say it was Cuba, it was Spain, it was, they didn't mention it. They just left it. So the press says, oh, so now what we're doing is we're covering up because we don't want a war. Now we're trying to hide something because we don't want there to be conflict. And they're like, oh, that's not what's going to happen. Remember those poor people who are hurting, who are starving. Why is the president, hiding with this? Why is this like a conspiracy? And the newspapers run wild, which is where you get those cartoons, as you mentioned, and that remember the Maine, our people, because Ray, it was our people, it was our brothers, our sisters, husbands, and why, all of these people. It becomes an American tragedy, and the president then is forced by newspapers, which led to, the community saying, do something. I mean, he has to go to Congress and he says, all right, listen, I need you to declare not war, but a blockade. He goes and says, I got to do something. And, what we're going to do is we're going to blockade, Cuba. We're going to blockade Spain. We're going to do this for 10 days. Well, then that ticks off the Spaniards. And so Spain then says, oh, you're going to blockade us? So that's fine. We'll declare war. So Spain then declares war, which is when we have to declare war. So it starts, I really think, because the press said, hey, we're going to tell you what the government's not telling you. It's Spain. Government has to act. They don't act quick enough or to the best ability of the people. Now we have a war.
Yeah, and this war is going to, I think, in some ways, really change American foreign policy. For the first time, you're really seeing the United States step out on the world stage in a way that it hadn't up to this point. I mean, America had been involved in, various things, but this is the first time America steps out to really start saying, we're going to, for example, control the Philippines, and then they put William Howard Taft in there as a governor. So you start seeing America stepping out, I guess you could say, Chris, as an empire, a global empire, taking steps to make that happen, because up to this point, you really don't see the United States doing that. And of course, it would just be a few years later, of course, McKinley would be assassinated, and Vice President Theodore Roosevelt would become president, and he would send a fleet of ships around the world called the Great White Fleet. Would basically, the message, the United States is here, we're a serious power, and you better pay attention.
And it is interesting. This is why history you didn't know but should, because the story doesn't end with mine, yellow journalism, war. There's an interesting facet that goes along with this, and that is that once again, not everybody believed what the government said, including people in the government. I don't know if we could call them a whistleblower back then, but there were a few officers, there were a few people who were there who fortunately survived. And they said, wait a second, the way that this happened, the way that it took place, there's no way that it was a mind that did it. And they began to promote a second theory, and the second theory being a coal fire theory. And, the ship is being used in with coal. That's how the ship moved. And Ray, for some reason, with the engineering of this brand new ship that you described and the discussion of the way that they built it, they had the magazines, or if you will, the ammunition, very close to the coal that is on fire that propels the ship. Well, Ray, if there's a spark that just happens to get near a firecracker, well, you're going to have a major situation. So imagine if your entire magazine of bullets and other types of ammunition right there by the fire pit, and there's just a little timber of flicker that goes, it is very, very possible that there's a large fire that takes place. And they actually did a little arson investigation and found that that was the origin of where the fire actually, or the explosion actually began. So there's no full 100% proof that it was a mine or that it was a coal fire, which is what makes history so cool, because even today it's still debated.
Yeah, today it's still debated. There are people who, I think the majority of people who study this sort of go with what you were talking about there, the magazine area of the ship. But it is certainly still debated today. And when you were talking, it reminded me of the battleship North Carolina. If you go down, and this part is on the public tour, but if you go down there and you get to certain areas where weapons are housed and powders are housed or were housed, during the war, World War II. And you can imagine many years earlier, obviously, if something was to catch fire there, something was to explode there, it would just cascade out of control. So you could see how, 50 years earlier in 1898, how that could have happened very easily.
So the dangerous weaponization of the media, because think about this. Many people today, what you just said, support the idea that this was a terrible accident.
Right.
Bad accident. That's what many people say. However, because of how the media portrayed it, America went to war. A lot of soldiers lost their lives. Here's where that whole thing about history, right? Because you can't go change history. It's happened. But Ray, it is possible that if the government might have been more forthcoming, if there had been more information, if there would have been the president who would have said, time out, let's all pause, let's take a step back, let's really think through this. But if things might have changed one little bit, there is the possibility that this Spanish-American War doesn't happen. Of course, it didn't spur the Spanish-American War, but it did kind of lead to the point of no return in the Spanish-American War. So that's what I love about history, is because there's so much debate and there's so many what ifs to there. But it also demonstrates the power of the media in 1998 and the power of the media in 2023.
Yeah, and one thing I want to just maybe sort of close on is that you've mentioned William Hearst and Pulitzer and these people. You know what Pulitzer said in private about this? Quote, nobody outside of a lunatic asylum would believe that Spain did this. So privately, even the people who were promoting some of the yellow journalism about the Maine admitted, yeah, probably not.
But why was it privately and not publicly?
Because it made money.
There you go.
It sold newspapers, and that's all they're interested in. Same with the media. This episode has really turned into a bash the media episode, Chris.
And here we are using the media to promote history you didn't know but should. But it tells us to be careful. Words do matter, whether printed or verbal, they matter.
Absolutely. Words do matter. And we hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Look us up on Facebook. Find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Podcasts. You can find our podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. We ask that you share this podcast with your family and friends. If you're on Spotify, by the way, do give us a like there on Spotify, and also follow us so that you will be notified of future episodes. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.